Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Greg Steinmetz, author of American Rascal, How Jay Gould Built Wall Street's Biggest Fortune. It's published by Simon & Schuster. It'll be released at the end of the month where you can get it at the bookstore. Greg is a journalist and security analyst. His first book was The Richest Man Who Ever Lived, The Life and Times of Jakob Fugger. So, robber barons, when we think of them, who comes to mind? The big four: Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan. Jay Gould doesn't come to mind, but Vanderbilt called him the smartest man in the country, and Rockefeller said he had the best head for interest for business as well. So maybe if Gould's name was on a concert hall or two or on a university, we would remember him as a household name. But Mark Twain condemned him, as well as Thomas Nast. He was tied to Tammany Hall, paid Boss Tweed's bail, and he drove to work in a 200-foot yacht. Many would say that his counterparts today are Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sergey Brin. But what would our world be without these robber barons? And what would our world be like without the same type of fellows in the Gilded Age at the fin de siècle of American prosperity and greed? So let's find out. Welcome, Greg, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Sam.
So, why don't we remember Jay Gould?
Well, there's an easy explanation for that. As you mentioned, he was part of the whatever you call it, the big five, big four of the robber barons. And his contribution was as big as any of them. And in some ways, he is the biggest robber of the barons. The things he did were considered the most notorious. But he had the misfortune of dying young. When you look at when Carnegie started Carnegie Hall, when Rockefeller endowed Rockefeller University here in New York, when Vanderbilt did Vanderbilt University, they were all in their 70s. Gould died when he was only 56. New York University already had their hooks in him, but he died before New York University became Gould University, in which case Gould would be a household name, I think.
So, the strangest thing is, I guess, the beginning of the book, he starts out drawing maps of Ulster County and the tannery business. So I guess people would wonder, how did he go about pulling himself up by his own bootstraps, if you will?
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, but one that isn't exceptional in that age when most of America was rural. Gould grew up very poor on a farm in upstate New York in the Catskills. His dad was a dairy farmer. He made cheese that he sold in New York and Albany. Gould had occasion to visit New York City when he was young and was very impressed and decided that he wanted to be rich. And I think the motivation for that was he grew up poor. He grew up in very hard circumstances. His mother died when he was only 4 years old. He had 6 older sisters, 2 of them died. And he thought that money could save him from a lot of misfortune and suffering. And he wanted to make sure that his own family never endured the same circumstances that he did. So he worked his tail off from a very young age.
Well, when he did things like, I don't know, after the tannery went bust and his partner kind of screwed him, didn't kind of screw him, but how did he have where did he get the knowledge that allowed him to realize that he could buy up land at cheap prices? Where did that intuition come from? Because it just doesn't happen to most people.
Yeah, I think Gould, well, first, Gould was very smart. And he would get up, before it was time for him to milk the cows, to read his math books and his history books for school by candlelight. He got started as a surveyor that was just an odd job that he could do to make some money when he didn't yet have an education or was able to do anything else other than work on a farm. It was a chance for him to have some income that was all his rather than just helping his dad. As a surveyor, he learned about real estate in his own county and in neighboring counties, and he just kept his eyes open for opportunities. And business is one can be self-taught in business. It's hard to be a self-taught chemist or self-taught doctor, but just by observing the fact that you can buy something cheaply and sell it dearly if you know the true value of it, Gould was able to go off on his own and figure out ways to make money. So from the surveying business, he learned about an opportunity to buy a hemlock forest in the Poconos, and he had, again, through his surveying business, he knew someone who could help him on the financial side, a guy named Zadok Pratt, who was one of the richest men in New York State at the time, who himself had built a tanning mill upstate New York, not far from where Gould lived, and together they went into business. And that was Gould's first foray into business on a major scale was in tanning. And from that, he got acquainted with the process of buying and selling tans, which occurred in New York City near Wall Street. Through that experience, he got to know about Wall Street. He decided the real money was made not in tanning cowhides, but in trading stocks and bonds. That took him to New York, and from there he went on to his biggest exploits.
It's funny, I just thought of something. It doesn't happen often in today's world, but there's violence in the book. There's an armed attempt to get him out of the place. And then during the book, sometimes he's punched in the face and things like that. That doesn't happen anymore. I don't think it does.
No, and that was what that told me was that, remember, this was an era when insider trading was legal, where self-dealing was legal by doing pump and dump schemes to inflate a stock price and then sell it was legal. So it was really the Wild West era of American capitalism. And with that came vigilante justice. You mentioned Gould getting punched in the face. That happened one day when he was at lunch at Delmonico's. It happened because the aggrieved party here wasn't getting justice in the courts. Gould had paid off all the judges. There's nothing this guy could do short of punching him in the face to find any level of satisfaction. The same thing happened when Gould had to go in with a little private militia of some loyal employees of his tanneries to seize back the tannery. He did this on the advice of counsel. Because of the way the ownership agreement was structured, Gould had the right to defend his property from trespassers. So the lawyer said, hey, do what it takes. So Gould, without having any experience with firearms, led a small militia and seized back his tannery.
Funny, at times I thought of this as like being a legitimate mafia in a sense, with people being bought off and threats and things like that.
Yeah, it's sort of a fine line at times.
Yeah. But the difference is that, well, whether the mafia is selling olive oil, that's not what they're really doing here. And I thought, a lot of these guys made their money with the railroads, and the railroads were a new thing, and Gould eventually owns controls 10,000 miles of track. Isn't it funny how the railroad then is like the internet now?
Yeah, the parallel is there. You can think of the railroads almost like a means of communication, because it shortened travel times, made it possible to not only get between places very quickly, but also to exchange ideas very quickly. And hand in hand with the railroads came the telegraphs, which made instant communications possible. And another parallel is, okay, here's this huge network that was fundamental to the economy of the age. And because it was brand new, Washington had no clue what to do about it. They didn't know how to regulate it. The railroad barons were very influential in Washington. And now we're seeing the same sort of hand-wringing in Washington over, how on earth do we get a hold of the internet? How on earth do we get a hold of crypto in a way that we don't shut down innovation and all the good that these things bring, but also to save people from being exploited. And now we have, in the case of crypto, people losing billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah, and you know better than anyone today how, you talk about information passaging, now milliseconds or nanoseconds, high frequency trading does exactly the same thing. And it in my mind, it can't be controlled almost, right?
Well, I know this, there will be efforts. There will be efforts to do something. And it's interesting to me that in Gould's age, there was no regulation. Now we have 40,000 rules on the books regulating finance. We have all these regulatory agencies. Stuff still goes on. It's hard to control animal spirits. It's hard to control greed. It's hard to control the profit motive in a way that benefits everyone equally. But efforts will be made.
Well, getting back to selling your book, if you talk about, the centerpiece of the book to a certain extent is eerie. And not only the machinations regarding the control of Erie, but the mind of Gould in the sense that, hey, if I raise the price of gold, then that'll raise the price of wheat, which will encourage passage on the railroad. Talk about Erie and then bring in the concept of cornering, which everybody understands today.
Yeah, some people that learn the lesson the hard way. Gould's first, sort of burst into national consciousness when he took on Commodore Vanderbilt to get control of the Erie Railroad, which has been described as the Appian Way of the United States. What the Erie was, it was the rail counterpart to the Erie Canal. Once the railroad got in business, the canal really didn't have much use anymore. So one of the most, if not the most important railroad in the country, Vanderbilt wanted control of it. A guy named Daniel Drew was in control of it. Gould figured out how, by buying voting rights for the stock, he could insert himself in the middle of the conflict between these two titans. He ended up siding with Drew and ultimately outsmarted Vanderbilt and got control of the railway. By doing that, it gave him access to a lot of cash. He could go to Wall Street, raise money for Erie, and do whatever he wanted with that money. What he decided to do was try to corner the market for gold, which was not only audacious, but in the minds of some foolish, because the government sat on vast reserves of gold. At any time, they could open the spigot, drive down the price of gold. So what Gould had to do is try to get Washington to buy into his idea that it should let the gold price run. He first tried to bribe President Grant. That didn't work, or was told, don't even try, the guy's incorruptible. So he didn't try to bribe Grant, but he did manage to bring in Grant's brother-in-law. Grant's brother-in-law persuaded the president to let the gold price run using Gould's arguments because it would be good for farmers. And for that reason, the gold price got out of control and Gould was able to make a lot of money on it. Although the only way he got out was he had this buddy, Jim Fisk, who's sort of his evil twin, or at least more evil twin, who fraudulently offered to buy up a lot of gold on the exchange, and that allowed Gould to get out at a good price. Now, this concept of cornering, which we know about now because people who hedge funds who have lost money on GameStop and other meme stocks. Gould used this to great success throughout his career. He recognized when he created a scarcity in shares of a particular company, and he would just exploit that opportunity every chance he got. And it was so successful, he even used it against one of his former stockbrokers, who was supposedly a friend of his, but the opportunity to make a lot of money was just so great that Gould couldn't resist. So he bought up all the stock he could. It was impossible for the stockbroker to buy back the shares that he borrowed. This gets into the technicalities of short selling, but Gould made a lot of money by cornering the market for this particular stock, Northern Pacific.
Was the stockbroker the little guy, the older guy that he convinced to do all this on the floor?
No, that was another one. to execute the gold trades, Gould needed a stooge on the floor of the gold exchange. So he found sort of a hard up elderly stockbroker who was just dazzled by Gould's wealth and would do anything Gould said, even if it meant creating tremendous personal liability. And this guy ended up blowing up as a result. That's a sad story.
Yeah, I felt really, the whole book is like, it's also a human story. And I really, you really feel for the guy. And you can almost feel him on the floor, realizing things are getting out of hand and then feeling like, he's falling through the center of the earth. It must have been a horrible experience.
Yeah, and Gould reconciled this. Gould thought of himself as being a moral person. But when it came to business, people who did business with him, in his mind, well, if they're stupid enough to fall for my deceptions, it's their own fault. All was fair in business. But what's interesting, Gould did have a redeeming side to him. He was a great family man, and as ruthless as he was with his business partners, he had a great marriage. He had 6 kids. He treated them very well. Was very loving. He was generous, although sort of sporadically. If he had a family member in need, he helped them out. If there was some charity that touched his heart, some cause that touched his heart, he would jump in. I don't know if you've seen any of that television show, The Gilded Age. I think it's on Netflix.
Yeah.
The main character is based on Gould.
Oh.
And the reason that is as the creator of that series was trying to come up with a leading man, Gould was more interesting than Carnegie or Rockefeller or Vanderbilt because he had this good side to him. So in the show, we have Gould being completely ruthless and cunning with his business partners or people who were his business adversaries. But on the other hand, was a wonderful family man. And the central conflict of that show is how the Goulds can't break into society because Lady Astor says, no, we don't want to be part of these nouveau riche people. And in real life, Gould and his wife struggled to break through, and they're more successful in the show than in real life. But I can understand why Gould would work as a character in that show, because he had his dark side, this evil side. You mentioned what Mark Twain said about him. The New York Times called him Mephistopheles. He was probably one of the most hated men in America. But at home, he was a good guy.
It's funny you say dark side and you said evil, and you think of, I always thought of Star Wars, the dark force, and it's funny because that's the question. I mean, if you bring it to today, there's all these people that think Elon Musk is pure evil, but look what we've gotten. NASA in 70 years hasn't been able to land a booster on the ground, and Starlink, which is helping the Ukraine right now, and Tesla. And that's just a few, whether it's the Boring Company or AI. Look what he's done. Same thing with whether it's Steve Jobs or Amazon.
It's the world. Yep.
So what are they?
It's the same thing. And one of the reasons the robber barons got a pass and were able to accumulate as much wealth that they did, was they were creating miracles. And what the railroad did in the 1870s and 80s, what the telegraph did. Gould for a time owned the New York Elevated Railroad, the precursor to the subway. They were bringing about meaningful improvements in the lives of everybody. So the risk that Washington faced was, well, if we act too hastily, we could cut off this engine of innovation that's bringing a lot of good. And we see the same happening now.
I guess, if not to beat a dead horse, but if you get down to the bottom line, I guess it's Machiavellian. Does the end justify the means? And you don't make a judgment with regard to that, and I can't either. So what do if I put you on
Well,
the spot?
the judgment I make, there's a line in the book Babbitt where he talks about how his lead character was morally flawed, was a bad guy, but was so supremely gifted at how he went about his business that you just had to admire him. And that's how I feel about Gould. I feel that there's a lot of things about him to admire: his work ethic, his intelligence, his ability to untangle very difficult problems, his ability to best people on Wall Street, equivalent of being very good at the poker table. There's things to admire about him, but he did have a hole at the center of his heart, I think, where he did not mind just running over people, even if it meant destroying them in the pursuit of lucre.
There's that NASC cartoon that shows the robber barons fat and happy, and underneath them are the workers supporting them, and it tells how much money they're making a day versus them, and that's the other side of the coin. Or you know what, we should talk about Black Friday, because a lot of people lost their shirts on that.
Yeah, well, Black Friday, the people who lost their shirts were other gold brokers. I don't think there are a lot of widows and orphans in that. But there we had a case where Gould was trying to bid up the gold price. Short sellers saw an opportunity to make a lot of money when the bubble burst, assuming that it would burst. But they could make that happen by allowing the gold price to just go up and up and up, encouraging that to the point where no one in the right mind would think that anyone on the other side of that trade could honor their commitments to buy gold at the price to which it climbed. So when it all came crashing down, the people who lost money there were other Wall Street types. There were investment bankers, there were speculators in the commodities market. I don't feel so bad for the direct victims, but there are indirect victims. There were farmers whose grains just stood on the loading docks and couldn't sell because the grain markets, as a result of what was going on in gold, were paralyzed. There were the employees that they had. There were the employees of just any company that was impacted by what was going on in Wall Street. A lot of people did, at least temporarily, lose their livelihood. There were some suicides that resulted from this. Right. There were indirect victims, as there would be, anytime you have an enormous financial calamity, which is what this was. The gold market really laid financial markets low for a while and dragged the whole economy down with it. But in terms of workers, it's interesting. There was a strike in 1886 involving Gould's railroads. It finally got resolved by governors sending in state militias to order at gunpoint workers back to work, or to allow scabs to run the lines. Gould behaved with characteristic ruthlessness in that instance, but unlike the other robber barons who had railroads and negotiated with workers, Gould directly negotiated with the labor union. He didn't say that the union didn't have a right to exist. He didn't say, I'm not going to dirty my hands with these people, just let the governors, my friends in the state houses with their armies, put an end to this. He did negotiate with the head of the labor unions, and in a way endorsed their right to organize. So you can't say that Gould was an upstanding human being because of this, but he was a little bit more, I think, sympathetic than some of his contemporaries.
The concept of communication was interesting, because I like the idea of these guys like Gould just walking over to Vanderbilt's mansion, walking in, they're sitting there drinking brandy and smoking cigars, trying to make a deal. And it's interesting how that happened. There was this civility, but then there was also this ruthlessness, again, almost like the mafia.
Yeah, and what I really enjoyed about telling this story is there is all this color. You're talking about how Gould and his buddy Jim Fisk went and knocked on the door of Vanderbilt's house down on Washington Square, and while Vanderbilt was just getting up from bed, they had this discussion about the Erie Railroad, and then that incident sort of repeats later at the house of Vanderbilt's lawyer. And there were these discussions, these one-on-one discussions, which nowadays a lot would be handled by the lawyers and the other intermediaries. But in those days, you didn't have these large organizations, these vast networks, and you didn't have regulations that sort of constrained what could be said and what couldn't be said in certain forums and discussions. Yeah, it was very human.
Well, what about the fact that, he was routinely and maybe through all of his business life condemned by primarily New York City and people, and then Mark Twain and Nast and all that? It seemed like in the book that he got more of the brunt of that than the other guys. Did he?
Oh, yeah. He did because, well, two reasons for that. One, he never really tried to defend himself. He didn't think it was worth it picking an argument in the press, because he just couldn't win, because the press could publish whatever it wanted. So he didn't see a need for that. He wasn't naturally inclined to defend himself with words, but also he saw some value in that. By promoting this image as being completely ruthless, it would scare those he was negotiating with into rolling over to his demands more quickly, and I think that succeeded. That was, he has a horrible legacy for what he did. He never did anything to try to shore up his legacy, although, as mentioned, had he lived longer, maybe he would have. But he did use his reputation as an advantage.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I don't know if any of the other guys did this, but his intimate relationship with Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, and Boss Tweed is condemned more than almost anybody in American history. Not only that, and making Boss Tweed director, but it was always like he kind of snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in a lot of situations, and then buying the judges and the litigation, which was always threatened, and getting out of it. It seemed like he got out of it pretty much all the time.
He got out of it all the time. The thing with Boss Tweed was it was a mutually beneficial relationship. Tweed would pass laws that were beneficial to Gould, and Gould would cut him in on the profits of his evil doing. And that lasted as long as Tweed stayed out of jail. Gould kept the ball rolling longer after Tweed was arrested. Gould was there with $1 million check to keep him out of jail. But the evidence against Tweed and the just pressure from Tweed's opponents to knock him out were just too great. So what Gould did after he didn't have Tweed anymore to influence the legislature and the judges was that he just had the best legal talent that money could buy. And he used the lawyers to just tie up his opponents in court. So even when his adversaries had terrific evidence against Gould, Gould could just tie them up with legal procedure and wear them down and get it to the point where they would settle for pennies on the dollar just to be done with it, to be done with the stress of litigation and to have some resolution. Gould did not mind that stress. He was very patient when it came to the courts, and he used legal procedure as well as anyone.
It's like Trump filing suit today, actually.
It's very similar, and that's just how the process works.
Yeah, it's delay.
As long as you can keep paying the lawyers. Gould could keep paying the lawyers. I wonder about Trump's resources sometimes.
You mentioned $1 million. One of the things you should explain, because it took me a while to really think about it, $1 million then is not $1 million now. I don't know if it's 20 times as much. Give me an idea of how rich it was.
Yeah. Yeah. If you think about it in terms of inflation, it's at least 20 million. But the way one normally thinks about how rich someone was for comparison purposes is to look at their wealth as a percentage of GDP. And when you do that, you don't have Elon Musk as being the richest American at all time. He's in the top 20, but you have Rockefeller on top because his wealth came to 1.5 points of GDP, which when you think about it now, we have a $27 trillion economy. If you have that much money, wow. So by doing it that way, Gould's safely in the top 15. And
Would
dollars 20 million, but it's a lot more than that.
Would Rockefeller have been the first trillionaire?
Well, 1% would be what did they say? Yeah, if it's 20, yeah, it would be 200 billion. Would that be right? Would be more. It'd be 1.5, 300 billion.
Yeah, 300. Maybe. Yeah, right. 1.5%. Right.
It would be more than that, if, but just to make the math easy, I think in 20 trillion.
Yeah, and the other thing is that kind of money would buy a lot more in certain areas than it does today.
Yeah, and the average worker, if you made $1 a day, he was doing okay.
Right.
It was really, people just made nothing. It was terrible.
Yeah, and the only reason I harp on it is because I honestly think when you're the general reader, I mean, not to denigrate the general reader, but when the general reader looks at this, those numbers have to be put in perspective to really understand what these guys were. They, the concept that they were really titans, and they could save the stock market. They did that too. Yeah. Well,
they, you look at their political influence, right? They control the biggest companies in the country, and those companies, not only because they could pay politicians, give them donations, bribe them, whatever, also because they employed lots and lots of people. They were very important. So they really had their way up until the Interstate Commerce Act got the ball rolling on federal regulation. That wasn't toward the end of Gould's life. So he had 30 years where he could do whatever he wanted and exploit the political process, make himself even more money.
I've forgotten, I should know, but who was that guy that began to create the framework for laws that might eventually rein in? I've forgotten that guy's name.
Yeah, that was Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the great-grandson of John Adams. Massachusetts, where he lived, of course, then is now at the vanguard of progressive legislation. Adams was disgusted by what he saw in this fight between Vanderbilt and Gould over the Erie. He was also disgusted by the Gold Corner. He thought it showed all the problems with having a completely free market. Unfettered capitalism bred these monopolists who he thought were a threat to everything that John Adams fought for and were undemocratic. He wrote an essay, which has been called one of the most influential essays in American history, called A Chapter of Erie, that appeared in 1869. It prompted the state of Massachusetts, where it was from, to start the Massachusetts Railroad Commission. That was the first state regulatory agency in the country, but it took another 20 years before Washington got involved with the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. So Adams was at first a lone voice talking about regulation. Up until that time, Emerson had spoke for everyone when he said, "Do not legislate, it will snap the sinews." Emerson was very fearful of how regulation could sap America of its vitality, deprive it of its destiny. Most people agreed with him. Adams was really the first to, in a big way, say, no, things are different now. That's fine when people are self-employed farmers, but when they're laborers working for big business, for the capitalists, that doesn't work anymore. But it took Washington a long time to come around to that, to share that view.
I was thinking, as I went through the book and, earlier saying victory from the jaws of defeat, in addition to all his just plain victories, that one situation, it's kind of interesting and funny with the British guy, Gordon.
Yeah.
Talk that story.
Yeah, that's a funny story, huh? There was, after Gould managed to seize the Erie from Vanderbilt, there was a group that tried to seize it from him by using capital markets and by finding some judges who weren't friendly to Gould. It looked like they were going to succeed. In his desperation, Gould fell for a scheme by a con artist who fashioned himself as a Scottish aristocrat who was in Parliament and an intimate of Queen Victoria, who promised that he could go back to Scotland and raise a lot more money so Gould could buy even more shares of Erie and solidify his position. Gould fell for it, gave him a bunch of money. A few days later, this guy disappeared. Gould did what he could to recover his money. In the meantime, this guy had fled to Canada. Gould pursued him, or used his people to pursue him, and the guy ends up killing himself a few years later in Canada. Gould gets back some of his money, but not all. But that story shows just how desperate he was to maintain control of Erie, because by having Erie, it gave him a tremendous power base and allowed him to do all sorts of stuff.
Two things I thought about.
Gould, that was probably the low point in terms of, Gould having done something really stupid. Gould didn't do a lot of stupid things.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, is how he could be hoodwinked by someone who was as cunning as he was.
It was desperation. And this guy also came on with good recommendations. Horace Greeley was the one who introduced them. Horace Greeley didn't think a lot about Gould as a person, but he liked how Gould made a lot of money, and he was hoping to get involved financially with Gould. And he's the one who introduced him, and it all went.
The other thing that was funny about that, theoretically, it almost created a war between Canada and the United States.
Did I say that in the book? I don't remember that.
I don't know. I started.
There was some diplomatic tensions.
Yeah.
Extradition and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know. I guess I overspoke. All right. Well, I guess the last question I would have is simply because of what you do on a day-to-day basis. How does that not only inform you, but what are the parallels between what you see on a day-to-day basis and what happened back then?
Well, although Gould made a lot of his money through extra legal means, there are a lot of things that he did that any investor can apply to what they do. As mentioned, Gould was very patient, not just with the courts, but he would wait for his opportunities, wait for the right price before buying. He knew his numbers. He knew the law. He understood what he was buying better than anyone. He gobbled up information. He would spend all day talking to people, trying to learn about opportunities. And then after having dinner with his families, he would go to the hotels frequented by traders and brokers after hours to gather more gossip. Although he never drank, but he spent a lot of time in bars. But I think the best lesson that Gould delivered was one that others learned the hard way, which is, watch what people do and not what they say. There's a line that I've heard about Gould that when his lips are moving, he's lying. When they're not, he's scheming. And anyone who had watched Gould's actions and looked at his track record, looked at his history, and looked what Gould committed to on paper would have done much better than just listening to what Gould said. Gould would talk up the prospects of a stock when he was selling it, and he would talk down its prospects when he was buying it. And anyone who just took what Gould said on face value lost a lot of money. So when I hear a CEO talking, that goes through my head, right? People can say whatever they want, but it's what they do. And the only way to really judge what someone's going to do is just look at what they've done in their past. Have they been credible in the past?
It almost seems like it should be easier now. And I know there wasn't any regulations and it was like the Wild West on the floor, but information passes so close to instantaneously now, when in the past you had to wait, weeks or days for correspondence to be exchanged, for the railroad to come back in. But doesn't it seem like today, or well, actually, is it easier today?
I think it's harder. It's harder in that everyone has access to information. So in those days, someone with resources like Gould could get better information. Now that's harder to do because of rules about simultaneous disclosure. There were instances where Gould, because he controlled Western Union, he also had access to information that came over the AP wire service before anyone else, and he could trade on that. That would not be possible today. So I think regulations have made it harder, at least for those with means, to make money in the market, but maybe level the playing field, which was the objective of the regulation.
When you say Western Union, I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to take all day for you. But all right, well, I'm going to ask you, talk a little bit about Western Union, because that really was the internet.
Yeah, it sure was. It was the internet of its day. You can see the obvious relationship with the railroad tracks. You have to string wires somewhere. Makes the most sense just to string them right by railroad lines. Gould owned the Union Pacific Railroad, the longest railroad in the country at the time, the Intercontinental Railroad. Union Pacific had its own telegraph cables, but Western Union had everything else. Gould really wanted Western Union. He tried first using technology that he bought from Tom Edison. They were briefly in partnership, faster way to send telegrams. That technology, he was hoping to disrupt the industry. That's a word we hear a lot about today. Gould was trying to disrupt telegraphy with Edison's technology and bring down Western Union that way. That didn't work. But he ultimately won the prize by just buying up more and more railroads, to the point where he could just cancel whatever contracts they had with Western Union in a way that meaningfully dented Western Union's profits, got the shareholders upset with how Western Union was losing money, and Gould was able to buy up Western Union stock on the cheap and ended up ousting Vanderbilt's son, William Vanderbilt, and got control of the railroad that way, of the Western Union that way. It's a great story.
Yeah, it really is a great story.
And Edison, when I was saying, okay, we can hate Gould for being a monster, but we also have to admire some things about him. That's the exact same opinion that Edison had of him. There are just guys like that who are really good at what they do. Gould was one of these guys. So as much as I can't stand the guy, I can't hate him too much.
One of the things as a bookseller that I look at, and everybody who walks into the store looks at, is the book cover. And I always thought it was since I've looked at the book, I always thought it was an interesting choice of yours to use the word rascal instead of talking about robber barons or tycoons. How did you choose rascal?
Well, my publisher actually came up with that. Priscilla Payton at Simon & Schuster. She thought he captured that duality in Gould. Okay, he was sneaky and underhanded, but short of being Satan. So rascal was a term that we came up with as a way to capture that.
It's a good word, because there's a little bit of mischievous, like Loki in Norse mythology. So what is it? I always say it's my last question. So what is it? He has this gigantic mausoleum. He has this boat. He has this yacht like Jeff Bezos is building, except Jeff Bezos is stuck because he can't get out of where he is because of the bridge. But what the hell is it about money? What is it that, you have enough to do anything you want? Yeah. And, at Carnegie, you realize at the end, maybe I should do something so I get into heaven. But what is it? What is the driving force that you have to have more, more, more?
It's just some people are wired that way. I didn't really get it, but just being number one. I don't know. It's if someone is extremely competitive, they want to win. And if you're Tom Brady, you want to win the Super Bowl every year. If you're on Wall Street, you want to make a lot of money and have more than the next guy. So I don't know. But you can never get enough. That's the sad thing, right? No matter how much these kind of people accumulate, it's never enough, and they always want more. And then it becomes ultimately corrupted.
So essentially, as I was thinking, it's a game. It's
the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and
Greg,
I think Gould came at it initially, honestly, he wanted enough to care for his family, but then it became a game, and it's a game he really enjoyed playing. And the way to play that game is to win. You end up
another last question. So he does the mausoleum, but then he leaves all his money to his kids, and then the opposite of the game. What do they do with it?
They squander it. He had 6 kids. He divided it up equally between them, which was interesting because the way other people did it, notably Vanderbilt, is he wanted to keep the empire intact. So he gave 95% of it to it was the second son in his case. Gould didn't do it that way. He thought, well, everyone should have an equal amount, and it's not that important to me that the empire stays intact. It's not that important to me that there's going to be a Gould out there who continues to show up as, you know, one of the richest people in the country. So I would split it with them. 2 of them managed it in a fairly disciplined manner, you know, gave it away thoughtfully. In one case, added to it a little bit, but the rest of them just squandered it. And one of them married a low-level French aristocrat who loved to spend money. Another one built the biggest house in the country, a place out in New Jersey. And 2 others also squandered it. It was kind of sad. And again, that's why we don't see anything named after Gould. His kids got the money and blew it.
Well, it was a fascinating story. On August 30th, it'll be on the front table of the bookstore. And thanks so much, Greg, for talking to me today about it. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun and great questions.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll talk to you next time. I would love to talk about the last book, but here I go again. But anyway, and that one will be out front too, because I loved it.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you
See you
very
later.
much.